he was able to, at that point, that all manifesto commitments would be met. And in fact, I think he said, unless I tell you otherwise, Mel. Do you agree with what the Prime
I always agree with the Prime Minister, Chair, but I think I have a reasonably perhaps pedantic and boring approach to this, but whenever I'm asked about anything to do with taxation, I hope you'll understand and forgive me that I give exactly the same answer so that no one can read anything into what I'm saying and therefore start speculating on what might or might not be the case. So my standard default answer to all questions about tax is I can't comment on future tax policy, and those decisions are made, as always, at budgets.
But you have just commented on the comments that the Prime Minister made to me at the Liaison Committee by saying that you would agree with them. In other words, that
I think I said I always agree. I always agree with the Prime Minister.
So I take from that we are going to stick to the commitment in the manifesto to the triple lock, and that we will not see increases in rates in any of the.
I think, Chair, you're obviously trying very hard to put words into my mouth. I'm going to give the same answer on all questions about future fiscal policy, is that I don't comment on future fiscal policy. Those decisions, as always, are made at future budgets.
But you do support what the Prime Minister said to me at the Liaison Committee.
I think you obviously know exactly what he said to you, Mel. I think you repeated back the full extent of his quote as well.
Okay, right. We will move on. Can I move on to gaps in support? You'll know, Chancellor, that we produced a report on this that shows that in excess of 1 million people have fallen through the gaps. In other words, they haven't qualified for the SAY scheme or furlough scheme, typically because of administrative complications. So if you take people working through their own companies, self-employed income received by way of dividend not being counted towards the calculation of furlough, for example, we're told by HMRC that those people can't be accommodated. There are 700,000 of them because of administrative complexity in terms of identifying where those dividends have come from. Is that the be-all and end-all of the problem there, or is there something else that we've missed? And specifically, therefore, if that complexity could be overcome, would those people get the support that most people feel they deserve and need?
I think what I'd say on this is, I'd repeat some of the comments I've made previously, that without a doubt, we've put in place unprecedented support for many millions of people in lots of different ways, and indeed millions of businesses as well through this crisis, and done so, I think, at a reasonably good speed to make sure that that support gets to those people as quickly as possible. But given that there are tens and tens of millions of people in the country, all with particularly different circumstances, and we faced an economic shock, the likes of which we haven't seen, it is obviously going to be the case that not every single person feels that they have been helped in exactly the way that they would have liked. And I can appreciate that, sympathise with it, and can only apologise for it, as I have previously. At this point, as I made the announcement in May about extending furlough and indeed providing an extension to the self-employment scheme, as I said at the time then, is that now we have to look forward. There wouldn't now be the opportunity or intention to introduce new schemes. The decisions that we made were difficult, and I'm happy to go into the reasons we made those in a second, but they were decisions that we made which I think are the right ones. And our focus now is on planning for the recovery, protecting jobs, which is why last week, obviously, we announced our plan for jobs and a new set of support to try and help drive the recovery and safeguard, protect, and create as many jobs as possible.
But you say that some people have been missed out. I mean, I'm referring specifically to the example I've given, to about 700,000 people. And if it is the case, and I think it is from what you have said, the Prime Minister has said, and indeed the head of HMRC has said, that it's basically an administrative complexity that has prevented help being provided. That seems to me to be quite a weak reason, given that you've shown an extraordinary ability to be nimble and agile in other areas. So, for example, when it's come to loans, 100% guarantees were brought in after the initial launch of the Bounce Back Loan Scheme, with the Sybil scheme, where you had the stranded middle. You very quickly plugged that gap. Even with furlough, actually, for new starters, there was a shift in the trigger date from the 23rd of February to the 19th of March to make sure that that worked more effectively. In other words, you have shown yourself to have great capacity to step in and fix problems. And I think the head of the HMRC actually said to us that he found that HMRC had ended up doing things that it didn't think it was capable of actually doing. But none of that political will and agility seems to have been applied to any of the categories that we've cited in our report, any of those million people plus who so desperately need help.
I think perhaps I'd say a couple of things, Chair. I think firstly, not all of those reasons were one of administration. Some of those were policy decisions deliberately to target support. For example, your report talked about the threshold we use of £50,000. Now that was a deliberate policy decision. That's not an administrative oversight. That was because when we're giving money to the self-employed, we obviously don't know their particular circumstances. The difference is for those who are employed, they are either furloughed or not. The company's making a decision about their employment status. For those who are self-employed, they could still be working for all we know and not in need of support. So that was one of the reasons we thought it was appropriate to apply a threshold, and we thought 50,000 was reasonable. It meant that 94% or so of those who were majority self-employed were covered. The average incomes of those over that threshold are £200,000. So on average, admittedly, there will be people who earn £50,001, and I appreciate for them this will feel difficult, but in aggregate, that group of people have incomes of around £200,000. We thought that was therefore a reasonable threshold to apply, given the policy design was trying to be targeted where it could to make sure support got to those who needed it. Ditto, I think your report talked about majority self-employed. Again, that was a policy decision which was made for the same reasons.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're segueing off into different categories. The one that I specifically raised was the 700,000 individuals working through their own companies and receiving self-employment income by way of dividend. Let me ask the question again. Is there anything other than administrative complexity that prevents you from including those people fully within the furlough arrangements?
I think there's a significant degree of administrative complexity, and to your point previously, the fact that we've been able to do so much that people thought we were not able to do, I think ought to actually prove the point that if there was an easy thing that we could have done and done at scale, speed, protect against fraud and make sure that support was targeted and obviously affordable within all of that, we would have done it. So I think that your point actually proves the thesis that if it was straightforward, given we've managed to do lots of other things, there's no reason why we wouldn't have done it. And I also think, as I said, the group of people that you mentioned, it's not as if there is no support available. Many of them choose to pay themselves up to the income tax threshold through PAYE. Obviously, that part of their earnings may be eligible. It obviously is eligible to be furloughed. Also, there's companies are able to access whether it's C-bills or bounce back loans, depending on what's appropriate for them as well. So there will be other support available for those individuals. They may also benefit from income tax self-assessment deferrals, of which about 3 million people did, to, I forget the exact number, of tens of billions of pounds of deferrals until next year, which will also help with cash flow. And then in their personal circumstances, for example, if they had a mortgage, they might have benefited from a mortgage holiday for potentially 6 months, which would have been quite significant as well. So, as I said, it may well be that they haven't got exactly what they've wanted, but there are other avenues that they may well have been able to access. And as I said in May, our focus now, and my focus for HMRC, and indeed everything else we're doing, is planning for and implementing policies for the recovery. And that is where I think our focus should be.
Well, okay. I think we'll come back to this point, I think, quite strongly in the rest of this this sitting, but for reasons of time, I'll move on to that. One final quick question to you, Chancellor, around corporate debt, which I know I raised with you in the House the other day. This is this idea that we know that there will be hundreds of thousands of SMEs saddled up with debt as they come through the crisis. We will want them to be investing in growing jobs, but they'll be worrying presumably about deleveraging and shoring up their balance sheets. And therefore, we should have a really good plan to ease the burden of that debt going forward. And I'm talking specifically here about SMEs rather than the larger companies. It didn't feature in your statement, but I know you're familiar with the issue, and I believe that Treasury may be working on it. Could you let us know when you think you might come back to this matter in a substantive way? And could you give us your assessment of how much of a challenge or a difficulty this issue might present to recovery?
Yeah, I think first of all, I'm not completely persuaded of the scale of the problem at the moment. For the simple reason is that we know corporate debt levels in the UK are in a relatively healthy place coming into this crisis. I think the latest report previously from the Bank of England talked about our leverage levels being low by historical standards, I think was a reference they had. Whether you look at capital gearing or net debt as a percentage of GDP, both of those ratios have close to halved from circa the 70s to circa the mid-30s to 40s from the crisis to now. So there's been quite a significant de-gearing. If you look at corporate debt levels as a percentage of GDP relative to OECD countries, again, we rank relatively favorably. So, and we know corporate cash balances have increased quite significantly through the crisis as people have been able to access liquidity and build up cash buffers. So I think our starting point is pretty positive, which is a good thing because companies have been, as I said, being prudent with their cash and leverage over the past several years since the last crisis. The other thing I'd say is, people talk about this. I'm not entirely sure it would be sensible for the government to have individual equity stakes necessarily in millions of very small businesses. I'm not sure that would be particularly practical. So some of the solutions I think need to be worked through. That said, we are, as always, open to interesting ideas that we think might help drive the recovery. And as you know, many different institutions, bodies, think tanks continue to come up with ideas and send them our way, and we'll happily take a look at them.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Can I turn now to Angela, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. Afternoon, Chancellor. When you appeared in May before the Lords Economic Affairs Committee, you acknowledged, and this is a quote, "It's not obvious that there'll be an immediate bounce back." We've since had the GDP monthly estimates for May, which were a very modest growth after a 25% fall in Q2. And we've had the OBR's fiscal forecast yesterday, of which the central scenario was the expectation of a 12.5% fall in GDP this year, with the potential in that scenario that the economy could be 3% smaller by 2025, or in a gloomier scenario, 6% smaller by 2025, with unemployment potentially due to rise to 4 million. So in that context, you must have made your decision about the summer statement. Your £30 billion package was called poorly timed and could trigger a sharp rise in unemployment by the National Institute of Economic Research. The IFS called it badly timed and poorly targeted, likely to do little to stop unemployment rising. This was about the job retention bonus and the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, both of which actually had to be given a ministerial direction by you because the chief accounting officer in HMRC wasn't convinced that they were value for money. Huge dead weight in the job retention bonus scheme, and the idea that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme has been launched too early when people are still too worried to go out. What do you have to say to those criticisms?
Thank you, Angela. And I think on the direction point, it's probably worth bearing in mind that the vast majority of schemes that have been implemented during this crisis have required directions. So every single one of the loan schemes, I think many of which were welcomed by the committee, for example, the bounce back loan schemes, the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, the future fund, and the business rates grants fund that provided cash grants to businesses in all of our constituencies, and indeed the discretionary grants top up, amongst others, all required directions. So, and that's so just to put it in context, I think most people broadly think those things were sensible and welcome and good things. So I think that's the first thing to say. I think the second thing is also in Jim's letter, as you would have read, it did acknowledge that there was a sound policy rationale for doing what we've done, but it was difficult given the speed at which we were moving and the novel nature of the policy, difficult for him in that environment of uncertainty to model precisely the impact, which I completely understand, and that is the environment, unfortunately, that we're operating in. You talked about the OBR forecast in a space of a few months. What the OBR previously had as a reference scenario has become an upside scenario, and there's a far different central scenario. The OBR are some of our best independent forecasters alongside the Bank of England, and in 3 months they've had quite a significant change in their outlook. So that, I think, highlights the degree of uncertainty with which we're operating in, which makes policy making difficult, obviously. But I firmly believe that it will and can make a difference. I think the way it's designed, particularly for those who are lower paid, it will serve as a significant incentive and reward to those, especially small and medium-sized companies, to protect employment. And that's something that I'm very cognizant of. As you said, we have the prospect of many people losing their jobs. I'm determined to do what I can to protect as many of those jobs as possible, and this, I believe, will help do that.
Well, instead of subsidising every single furloughed job, over 9 million of them, when the OBR is suggesting that about 1.3 million of those on furlough will lose their jobs in the recession, surely you could have had less dead weight if you'd have focused help in the furlough scheme on a more sectoral basis. Since looking at the GDP monthly estimates, it's quite clear that the effect of different sectors of the economy of the coronavirus lockdown is very, very different. So you could have focused it more if you'd have wanted. Why didn't you do that?
I mean, you talk about deadweight, Angela. That was one of the criticisms of the original furlough scheme, that it would have deadweight because it was open to absolutely every company and business in the country, regardless of what was happening to them, regardless of their size. We took a deliberate decision to do that. And again, so I think now most people think that the furlough scheme was a good and sensible innovation, indeed has helped protect many millions of jobs. But without a doubt, there was dead weight in that scheme as well. So that's, I think, the first thing I'd say. And I think in terms of targeting it, as many have made the point, actually implementing it in practice is very difficult. Trying to sit here in this office and figure out which companies and industries should or should not be eligible, and then to think, even if you could solve that problem, how to think about the supply chain for that industry. And then again, there are companies that are half in, half out. Trying to do that across 1 million businesses and 9 million employees, I just didn't think was practical or feasible to deliver, so decided not to. But I mean, again, if you think there are sectors, I'm interested to hear, which sectors do you think should not be eligible for the job retention bonus?
Well, it's an issue of how the economy is being affected by the lockdown, and we've seen from the look in the GDP estimates that different sectors are affected very differently, and some sectors are still closed by government diktat. So it seems at least that you should be focusing some extra help on those sectors that still can't open because the government, I think, it's not fair for them to open. So I'd turn it back on you. I do think that you're the policymaker, I'm the questioner. You do have to think, as we move out of the lockdown itself, which was all encompassing, whether you need to focus your assistance more effectively. And let me ask you about a particular sector that is affected, aerospace, for example. 102,000 UK manufacturing jobs, 100,000 in the sector, very high productivity, very export risk, rich, high skill sector, but there's no sectoral strategic approach. And when I asked you about this in Treasury questions, Chancellor, you talked about buses. I mean, surely there's an area there where we need to be focusing on what we're good at to try and preserve as much of our civil aerospace sector and take it towards a much more green future, as possible, like many of our competitors are doing?
Yeah, so I think just to go back first, I think it's easy to say with the job retention bonus, oh, it should be targeted, but then no one is able to say which sectors they think should be excluded from it. And I think that's partly the challenge. And I think even the Shadow Chancellor herself has also acknowledged it's very difficult and there are hard choices and difficult boundary issues. And when you've got a scheme that is affecting so many millions of people and 1 million firms, I think it's very difficult to actually figure out where to draw those boundaries in a way that would make sure that support gets to everywhere you need it to get to. So again, I remain of the view that it's actually too hard to implement something that would then not undermine the policy objectives you're trying to achieve. And again, no one seems to be able to say which sectors they would exclude, which is what that means. But to your second point on aerospace, I think that the reason I talk about buses when you asked the question in the Commons, Angela, was because I think from memory you referenced the US support for airlines. And the point, and if I'm misremembering that, then please do correct me. And the reason for that, I think it's an important one, is the US obviously have put in place quite significant support for their airline industry, different to aerospace, but the airline industry. And I think the reason why it's different here is because they're doing that partly because, or primarily because, airlines in the US provide domestic connectivity within the United States. Now, we have provided very significant support for our rail network, the billions of pounds, and extra funding for our bus network, because those are the parts of the transportation system that provide inland connectivity that obviously have been significantly impacted by coronavirus, and we want to preserve that connectivity. To your point on aerospace more generally, I agree with you, it's an important sector for the UK. It's a considerable strength of ours. I can't obviously comment on individual conversations we have with companies. Now, many companies in that space are able to access much of the, or a lot of the things that we have already put in place, particularly some of the things we've put in place for larger businesses. And the issue they're facing is not one that government policy can readily correct. If there is a global slump in passenger travel, as we saw after 9/11, and potentially years of recovery in seat miles, that just has an impact on the revenue and profitability of businesses because they're doing less maintenance, less parts work, etc., and there are less orders for new planes. There's not a lot that government policy can do about that, as was the case in 9/11. But by investing in things like R&D alongside the sector, which we are doing, we're able to make sure that we have the foundation for future growth.
Chancellor, you didn't even mention childcare in your summer budget statement. Given that women have been very badly affected by the lockdown, why did you choose not to do that?
I mean, it was about a 22-minute statement, Angela. There are probably many parts of the economy, many sectors, many types of families that have been impacted that we couldn't mention in 22 minutes, so you'll forgive me for that. Obviously, you're right to say women have been impacted by the lockdown. In particular, they are disproportionately likely to work in the hospitality sector, which is why the various interventions that we put in place to help protect the 2 million jobs in that sector, I think you weren't a big fan of the Eat Out to Help Out one, but that is designed particularly to try and safeguard those jobs that will disproportionately not just benefit women, but also young people and indeed those from ethnic minorities and some of our more deprived coastal and rural communities. With regard to childcare and nurseries in general, what I can say is that nurseries this year have received a full business rates holiday for the 12 months, and as providers, those childcare providers are receiving all the government funding that they would have got, regardless of whether they are actually getting those children in and providing that service. That equates to about 50% of their revenue, which we have stood behind. So the business rates discount, 50% of the revenue guarantee, regardless of their activity, supports that sector. But you're right about the impact on women, which is why I believe things like the Eat Out to Help Out are important in trying to safeguard those women's jobs.
And finally, Chancellor, I just want to come back to an issue of value for money and public procurement. I was fairly staggered to have a look at the cost in your summer statement of PPE to date, £15 billion on procuring PPE. Obviously, given that there is a health emergency, it's possible for procurement contracts to be made very quickly without the usual safeguards being in place. Are you worried about value for money in public procurement in this area, especially given some of the examples of contracts which are just now coming to light? For example, Pest Fix, with listed assets of £18,000 that was given a £32 million contract to supply surgical gowns from China, not to make them, but to supply them. And has still only delivered half of those sitting in a warehouse somewhere unused by the NHS. Or an employment company with net assets of £623 awarded an £18 million government contract to supply face masks, or a confectionery wholesaler given a £100 million contract to supply PPE with no previous obvious examples or expertise in this area. Doesn't those examples and the level of money that's had to be spent actually worry you about value for money?
Have a brief answer. I'm sorry to hurry you. We're just a bit tight on our schedule, but brief answer.
Yeah, Andrew, I'll ask Dan to just make sure that he's not sitting here to give you a little bit of detail, and then I'll give you a kind of broader, quick reflection if Mel lets me.
I mean, one thing to clarify is that the figures that are in the summer economic update, the annex about COVID support, those are about approvals of an actual spending. So this is how much the Treasury has approved departments to spend for the financial year. So it doesn't represent what they've spent. I know this came up with one of my Treasury colleagues in the Public Accounts Committee where, I mean, we're very clear that departments still have to apply managing public money. The Treasury is still scrutinising requests for novel, contentious or repercussive spending. Clearly, given the nature of the crisis, we did a lot of spending approvals at pace, but it is still a requirement for the department to follow managing public money and for accounting officers to satisfy themselves that contracts they're signing and so on are good value for money. And departments will have to report in the normal way through estimates and so on, actually what they have spent relative to the amount of money that has been approved.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And Andrew, I just add, you know, we obviously are not responsible for the individual contracts. That is something that individual departments would be in charge of. As Dan alluded to, you'll remember the acute phase of this crisis. There was global shortage of PPE, everybody trying to get their hands on it. We delegated a lot of authority to the NHS, which is what the NHS wanted, so that they could move quickly and nimbly to get PPE for our country. And as I said, we were, you know, it's easy to sit here now. That phase was particularly acute. There was enormous stress. So we were able to try and provide funding and approval, as Dan said, in a slightly different way, so that DHSC and the NHS ultimately are the ones who are doing this, were able to move at pace. And no doubt they will be able to talk to you and other committees about those particular contracts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that, and I look forward to some better explanation from the departments concerned. I have to
remind members to stick strictly to our 10 minutes, if I may, please. I'm going now to Felicity, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for taking the time this afternoon. My questions are on changes to taxation, stamp duty and VAT. First of all, on stamp duty, I'd like to say I welcome the temporary cut in stamp duty. But do you think that you've missed an opportunity here to do a root and branch review of stamp duty? Because I personally feel as though it's a tax on social mobility, and also the rates at the middle and the top end of the market, 5, 10, 12%, are quite punitive, and I would argue are a deterrent to transactions. Certainly, that's our experience in my constituency of Kensington.
Lucy, thanks for the question. I mean, obviously, what we were trying to do here was not reform the overall tax system. We were trying to move at pace to inject some life into a market which showed signs of being in difficult place. We saw transactions down 50%, mortgage approvals down, I think, closer to 90 from memory, and house prices falling for the first time in 8 years, predictions that transaction volumes wouldn't recover for a few years. You know, all of that was worrying to me and to the team partly because housing movement catalyses lots of other activity. We know that when someone moves home, an interesting study that was done in 08-09, the last time this happened, was that catalysed about 5.1% of the value of the house in additional spending in the first year, and then 0.7% the next year. We know that household-related consumption is worth about 5% of consumption. So, if people were buying, moving, selling, and then renovating, doing up, we thought that would be good for jobs, good for economic activity, which is why we acted in the way that we did. Your broader questions about the structure of taxation, I'm probably happy to listen to. Obviously, those are the kind of things that we would deal with at budgets, as I referred to my earlier answer. And you're right. Most countries tax property. I don't have the figures to hand, as Dan might, but we tax transactions. Other countries tax asset values. There's different ways that people have done it. I think the big improvement we've obviously made over time is to move to our now progressive system versus the different system, the slab versus the slice model that we had before, which I think everyone acknowledges is a welcome change. And the last thing I'd flag is, because of the changes we've made to first-time buyers, the vast majority of first-time buyers don't pay any stamp duty at all. I don't know, Dan, do you have anything to add on that?
Not really, all right. I mean, most countries have a form of transaction tax and a form of recurrent property tax, like council tax, that we have. The relative values of those is very different in different economies, but most people have both a transaction tax and a recurrent tax of some kind.
Now, the estimate for the cost of the change is £3.8 billion. Is there a risk here that we're subsidising transactions that would have happened in any instance that were already in the pipeline?
There's definitely a risk of that, especially when you do something like this. What we know last time around this was done, the reset in 08, was it 08 or 09? I forget, it was 08.
It was end of 2008.
Yeah, end of 08 into 09. We know that roughly, it generated an increase in transaction volume of about 20%, which was positive. Now, clearly, what it is going to do, to your point, is bring forward transactions that would have happened otherwise. They will now just happen sooner than they otherwise would, Felicity. So you're absolutely right. Now, ordinarily, that wouldn't be a good thing. Right now, that is actually what we want to have happen, right? We need the activity now to help drive a recovery, given the situation we're in, as Angela walked us through the OBR numbers. So in this particular instance, when you're dealing with a recession like this, that's exactly what you want to do, is try and bring forward some economic activity to a time when we really need it. But you're right, many of those would have been transactions that would have happened otherwise, but there's value to us in them happening now rather than later to protect and safeguard jobs.
Moving on to the changes to VAT, is there a risk with those changes that it does not pass through to the consumer, and effectively the £4.1 billion earmarked for the cost to VAT effectively just becomes an extra grant for those sectors?
Well, look, I obviously am not going to be able to sit here and direct the pricing of every single business in the country, and that wouldn't be right or appropriate. But I think throughout this crisis, businesses have been doing a difficult job, and they've responded well when there's things that have been asked of them. What we do know is that last time around, when we had a generalised VAT cut, again in 08-09, about 4 out of 5 businesses, from memory, passed that VAT cut on to consumers. I was out today getting my lunch, and that was certainly the case. And I know lots of companies are making a feature of that, but obviously it will be a decision for individual companies to make. But I think the important thing is, whether the benefit slightly flows to consumers or to the businesses, it's some mix of that. All of that is helpful for safeguarding jobs. And that's what this is about. There are 2.4 million people who work in these sectors, about 150,000 businesses, and there will be different ways that benefit flows through, but it will fundamentally make it more likely that we can safeguard more of those jobs, and that's what this is about.
Now, the changes to VAT are due to end on January the 12th. Isn't there an argument that that's exactly when you need to be encouraging people to go out to restaurants and bars, that in November and December they may already be doing so in the run-up to Christmas, and it's in January that businesses and consumers will need the stimulus?
Yeah, I think fair point, Fissy. We obviously can't do this forever. It's very expensive. So the question is, should we have waited till then, or should we act now? I think given the situation that we're just coming out of lockdown, these are businesses that have been closed. People are not used to going out and about. And we thought the time to act is now. By coincidence or whatever you want to call it, I think there's about 4 or 5 other countries who have done something similar. I think Belgium, Austria, Cyprus. I'm trying to remember the others. There's a couple there's about 4 or 5 that have done targeted VAT cuts in these sectors, and Norway. Almost all of them end in October, December, January, actually, because they've all done similar timeframes of support. But I think, for this industry right now, they've just opened up. They've been through a really tough time. This is when they need our help.
We've heard from a number of pubs that they are concerned that alcoholic drinks are not part of the VAT reduction. What was your thinking there?
I think just probably the obvious one. I mean, there's a public health imperative as well alongside it, and it's fairly common. I think both Ireland and France, from memory, have excluded alcoholic drinks from similar measures that they've taken. I think Germany actually excluded non-alcoholic drinks as well, from memory. So I don't think it's uncommon. And as I said, we want to be mindful of the public health side of things as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm mindful of the fact that you don't want to talk about future changes to fiscal policy, but let me just ask you a couple of general questions. Our business rates are clearly a real issue for high streets. Now, you have committed to a fundamental review of business rates. When do you expect to opine on that? And do you have the flexibility to make major changes given the deficit at the moment?
Felicity, I think, as you rightly highlighted, we remain committed to a fundamental review of business rates. And I think we said we will publish the next stage of that relatively shortly, and we remain committed to that timetable. So, we'll put that out there to get people's views.
So it will be a consultation paper that you will publish?
Yes. You forgive me if I'm going to get this not completely right between call for evidences and consultations or fundamental reviews, but there is some form of engagement on that happening, as we committed to doing in budget.
We actually published the terms of reference for the review in March around the time of the budget. I feel like it was potentially just before the budget, but I can't remember the exact date. And yeah, we're due to publish a call for evidence, which will go into a bit more detail about the areas on which we're seeking input from businesses and others.
Great. And then clearly yesterday you asked the OTS to investigate capital gains tax. Again, I'm conscious you don't want to talk about future fiscal policy, but what you're thinking behind that?
Yeah, what I'd say is it's a reasonably business as usual practice for the Treasury to ask the Office for Tax Simplification to examine various parts of our tax system to make sure that they're up to date. It happens every year. So the last year or two, the OTS have looked at inheritance tax. Before that, they looked at capital reliefs. Before that, they've looked at VAT. They've looked at stamp duty, and then before that, income tax and national insurance. So I think actually capital gains tax is just the only one they haven't looked at. If you look back at everything they've done over the last few years, and it is just as a matter of annual administration that they pick a new area of tax policy, or we jointly pick an area for them to look at. As I said, they've done all those other taxes over the past few years, and this is just the next one on the block to look at it.
And just one final question. I think that there's been a general welcome of the £5,000 subsidy to green houses. However, we are hearing from lots of manufacturers that until there is clarity on what will be subsidised, orders are being pulled left, right and centre because people are concerned about proceeding with works now and not getting a subsidy. When will you be able to give clarity?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, Felicity, and one I'm cognizant of, and has been raised with me by other colleagues as well, including the honourable member for Shipley. I've spoken to Alok Sharma, the business secretary, about this because it's actually his department that run this initiative. It's modelled quite closely on something that they've done previously called the Green Deal Home Improvement Grant or Fund. It primarily funds things like cavity wall and solid wall insulation, where there's the greatest return on public subsidy for a carbon saving, and it makes the most behavioural difference. I think those are the primary measures, and once those are done, you can add on secondary measures as well. Alok is aware of the issue that you've raised, and I think BEIS are planning to try and provide further clarity and guidance as quickly as possible in advance of the scheme actually going live in a month and a half or 2 months. But it's a fair point, and I can reassure you that the business secretary and his team are on it.
Thank you. That's my time up.
Thanks, Felicity. Going now to Alison, please.
Thank you, Chair. In March, you told us that you were alive to the urgency of action and you were working to ensure that people could get the support they needed. You'll be aware of our committee report published last month, which highlighted that over 1 million people have not been eligible for support through either the Job Retention Scheme or CEASE. Can you honestly tell us today that you're satisfied that you've done the best you can to support those whose livelihoods have been affected?
Yes, Alison, I'd say I know there will be people out there who feel that they have not got help in the exact way that they would have liked to. I completely understand that. I sympathise with that, and indeed I apologise for it. We took the decisions we did, not all easy decisions, so that we could help as many people as possible, as quickly and as fairly as possible. And I do believe we did succeed in that aim. That doesn't mean that there are people who, as I said, feel that they should have been treated in a different way. As I've said previously, there are lots of different things out there that people can access for support. It's not just the self-employment scheme or the furlough scheme, whether it's loans or mortgage holidays or changes to our safety net, council tax grants, etc. All of which I hope will make a difference. But I understand why people feel that way.
I mean, this really isn't about people not having the support they would have liked. My inbox, and I'm sure my colleagues in the committee, all of our inboxes are absolutely crammed full of ordinary people, tradespeople, taxi drivers, beauticians, freelancers. Some of them have had no support at all. That's correct, isn't it?
I mean, there will be some people who have not been able to get the help in the way that they would have liked to get it. I mean, Taxi Drivers Association, I think, were actually quite positive and complimentary about the self-employment scheme in particular, but
it's not the support they would have liked. They've not had support at all.
Well, I obviously don't know the individual circumstances of every single person, but as I said, for those who are renting, we've strengthened the local housing allowance with billions of extra pounds to make sure that rents up to the 30th percentile are covered. For those with mortgages, we've instituted standardised mortgage holidays, which now
those aren't about incomes, though. Not about protecting
mortgages are taking advantage of. We've strengthened universal credit. We've provided small business loans for people who have businesses. So there are lots of different ways. We've provided cash grants for small businesses, business rate holidays. So there's lots of different things that have happened. Obviously, there are 50 million adults in this country, and I don't know the individual circumstances of every single one. And are there going to be people who are having a really difficult time at the moment? Of course there are. There's no way I can make sure that every one of 50 million people is completely unaffected by this. It would be unrealistic to expect otherwise. But I do take some comfort in the results and the analysis that we published alongside the statement last week, which showed a distribution analysis of how household incomes have fared during this crisis. And what that analysis very clearly shows is that those in the lowest income deciles of household income have had their incomes on average protected the most. So, is what we've done completely perfect? Absolutely not. Has it impacted absolutely everybody? Obviously not. But in general, on aggregate, it has helped a lot of people, and the most vulnerable, those at the poorest in our society, have been helped the most.
There are now almost a third of members of Parliament that are members of the excluded UK APPG, which I am pleased to co-chair. Will you listen to the concerns raised by the APPG? Will you meet with the APPG, and will you look now to find ways of addressing the people that have been missed?
Again, I echo and repeat what I've said before. I've explained why we've made the decisions that we've made. We've put in place various different things. I've listened to people all the way along. I've had questions multiple times in Parliament, from the media, speaking to many stakeholder groups. But at this point, we are now looking forward. We're not looking to introduce new things for the past. We're now looking to try and protect, create and support jobs for the future. And our focus is on delivering the policies that we announced last week. Given, as Angela pointed out to us, we have a pretty distressing set of economic forecasts to contend with. We have many people who are at the risk of losing their jobs, and while we're throwing all our energy now at trying to protect as many of those jobs as possible, create new ones, and support people to find those new opportunities. That's what our energy is now focused on.
Well, looking to the future doesn't really help the over 1 million people who have not had the support that they need. Would you accept that it's unfair that the setup of the job retention scheme in CEASE means that very similar households, next door neighbours, could see thousands of pounds of difference in support because of perhaps a single day delay in an RTI notice to HMRC, or a single pound above a £50,000 threshold?
I accept that the £50,000 threshold means that someone who earns £50,001 will feel particularly upset. That is absolutely right. What would the answer be? I think you either would say we don't think there should be a threshold at all, but then we've had this conversation previously about dead weight. So this is trying to minimise dead weight in action. It means that you have to make some hard decisions, therefore you have a threshold. Now, why is £50,000 appropriate? I think it is defensible. Obviously, it's hard for the person who earns just the other side of it, but we have to make policy in aggregate. Setting a threshold at £50,000 means that 95% of people are included. So this is just the top 5% of incomes, and on average, they earn £200,000. And I thought it was reasonable, given that we don't know about whether these people are impacted or not by coronavirus, they're just receiving cash from the taxpayer. I thought it was reasonable to make the assumption that those above that threshold, the top 5% earning people of this group, we could say, we hope that you have the financial resilience, and we should concentrate our support on those earning under £50,000, cognizant that that covers 95% of people.
You've had a long time now, since March, to look at this and review the policies and review the job retention scheme and CEASE. Why have you decided not to make any further changes?
I think for the reasons that I've just set out, we made the decisions that we made for the reasons that we made them. I've explained them as best I can, and when we extended the schemes in May, I said at that point that I acknowledge people would be upset and would feel that they haven't got the help they needed, but at this point forward, we were looking to focus on the future, and we could not introduce new schemes to deal with these things, or indeed, as I've said previously, some of these are conscious policy decisions. So the best I can do is explain why I've made those decisions.
You said the average is 200,000. What's the median?
I don't have it to hand. It is. I don't have it to hand. I don't think. No, I don't have it to hand. So.
Can you send that to us?
I will see if we've got it. Yeah.
And lastly, there's been a huge amount of attention to the maternity petition the Petitions Committee have looked at. Would you consider extending parental leave for 3 months?
So I think with regard to the maternity side of things, we did make a change to the self-employment scheme after engaging with stakeholders to make sure those who are their eligibility was threatened by them not qualifying in the relevant year, had the ability to use previous years to then qualify for the scheme. So that was something that was fixed and accommodated reasonably recently.
Okay, I'm done at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alison. And I think, Steve, you had one quick question on this section. You need to unmute, Steve, sorry.
Thank you. Chancellor, in case it wasn't clear at the very robust session that we had with the Chief Secretary, I think it's clear that I and others wanted changes to help those people who have been excluded from help. But you seem to be saying today now very clearly that you're drawing a line under any possibility of changing the schemes to help those people. Can you confirm that that is what you are saying today? And have you had any political advice on the consequences of saying that?
Steve, something I said actually back in May when we made the announcements about extensions to the self-employment scheme and the furlough, and acknowledged this point about people not feeling that they've had the help they needed, and then drawing a line. And I can't remember if I used that exact phrase or not, but I was clear then, and just re-explaining the reasons for the decisions that we've already made.
Well, I think you've made it very clear where we all stand, but I don't look forward to the email.
Okay, right. Can we move now to Harriet, please?
Thank you very much, Chancellor. And I know that the gilt markets are drawing reassurance from the fact that you in the past have been so firmly of the view that governments should be careful with the size of the deficits that they run. And I think, to quote you directly, you felt that deficits over 90%, could start to damage growth by 1% a year. And I just wondered if you could update the committee. At the budget in March, you said that the debt interest this year would be £56 billion, so the third highest spending department in government. Obviously, interest rates are at a record low. Can you just update the committee as to what the expectation of that outturn will be this financial year?
Harriet, thanks. I don't have an up-to-date number for you. The OBR would do that, as you would know, in the ordinary matter of course, where they can fully cost everything, come to autumn budget. But you're right, it will be a reflection of two moving parts. The debt will be higher, but the rates will be lower, and those two things, I think, they might be that they largely offset each other in the short term, actually. But we need to see, because that's a constantly evolving picture. Your point before is spot on, and I think I was quoting this kind of reasonably famous Reinhardt and Rogoff paper about debt to GDP and the impact that was. I mean, I think, I can't remember when the paper was written exactly, but it would have been written on the basis of probably far higher interest rates than we're now experiencing. I mean, for a long period of time, long-term nominal interest rates in Western countries like ours or the US were figured to be 4-5%. Clearly they're not, and considerably less than 1% at the moment. So that is a different environment, and probably, to the extent you think that is sustainable, would have a different view on your ability to carry a higher debt burden. So what I would say is, if 90% was the right answer some time ago, you'd probably have to think about that differently in an era of low rates. But your point is very well made. It's the sustainability of those low rates, which no one can know perfectly, which is why I think any future fiscal framework, as we started moving towards anyway, would need to have some recognition of interest costs in it to deal with the fact that if you're carrying such a high debt load and interest rates change, that's the problem for your fiscal sustainability. So you would want to have something that could accommodate that and make sure that you were responsive to a change in that environment.
Yes, because whatever obviously we can't predict what interest rates are going to do, but we can say with fairly high degree of confidence that they're about as low as they're ever going to be. Particularly with the amount that you're exercising the nation's credit card at the moment. So I note that in the introduction from the chair, you obviously didn't deny the fact that taxes are going to have to go up, and obviously you're not going to be drawn on which taxes. So I'm going to try Dan, and I'm going to say, Dan, are there any taxes? Are there any taxes that you are not currently doing analysis on, and I'm particularly interested in the sugar tax, which came in when I was a Treasury Minister, and I know the Prime Minister's mentioned the need for us all to keep our waistlines down, and I'm no exception. And I also wondered in terms of the fuel duty stabiliser, which came in 2011. It came in with a specific premise that if oil prices fell to the kinds of levels that we're seeing now, that it would be looked at again. So, Dan, can I draw you out a bit on which taxes the Treasury is not looking at?
If you don't mind, Harriet, just before Dan attempts to find a way to answer that, in terms of what I said previously, just not to make sure that we're clear, I'm going to say exactly the same thing all the time. So rather than think, oh, you haven't confirmed or you haven't denied X, I don't want people to get into this habit between now and autumn budget of trying to read things into what I say. I say this clearly to any journalist I speak to, any colleague. I'm going to give the same answer, which is I'm just not going to comment on future fiscal policy. And people should not then infer, well, you didn't rule this out or you do rule this in, because that is just, I'm just giving you the same answer every single time. And in the same vein, it will be difficult for Dan to answer that question because we of course we look at everything all the time. That's what we do. I think your broader point is right about fiscal sustainability, Harriet, and it's one that I share, and you're right to highlight it in the way that you have, and you should keep pushing me on it. But in terms of what does that mean for spending and taxes, those are decisions that have to wait until we get to budgets. But look, there are tough choices ahead. That is clear. We have an ambition to deliver on our priorities and the promises we made. We've been through this, hopefully once in a lifetime episode. It's had an enormous impact on our economy, on jobs, and our public finances, and that means that there are some, as I said, tough choices to come. But it's difficult for us to go into more detail than that.
I gave it a good try. I'm going to change the subject completely. In November 2018. The Treasury published its estimate of what the various different types of free trade agreement that we might strike with the EU would be, and also what the most optimistic forecast might be of very good trade deals with the rest of the world. And I wondered whether the Treasury has plans to update those because, November 2018, a lot of water has flown under the bridge since then.
Yeah, there's no specific plans. I think at the time, Harriet, obviously I wasn't there. I remember the foreword of that report saying something to the effect of, these are scenarios, not forecasts. There's inherent uncertainty in that kind of work, and they should be treated with caution. And I think one thing that I am, probably humble about is the ability of economic forecasting, particularly right now, to be that accurate, right?
Okay. I think. Fair enough. But yesterday, I think it was Monday, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster did update Parliament in terms of what some of the potential transactions costs will be for businesses. And I just wondered, in light of that, what the potential impact is on our outlook for economic growth.
Yeah, no, so we haven't done a macro forecast, or we're not planning to. And I think given all the other uncertainty we're seeing in our economy, it probably would not be a particularly accurate or constructive exercise. I don't know if Dan would disagree with that. But you're right, on the discrete things that we're doing as part of preparing for a new set of trading relationships, it's right that as CDL did, provide information around that, partly on some of the transaction costs, but also the investment we're making, the close to £800 million in both resources, staffing, and border infrastructure to prepare ourselves properly. Not only is that the right thing to do, because we should be ready as a country and work with our businesses, but I think it also sends a strong signal to our European friends and allies that we are getting ready, right? They should not assume that just because of coronavirus we are in some defensive position that we need something from them. We are ready to embrace our future. We're making the preparations that are required. We're investing in what's required to prepare ourselves for it at our borders, and we very much hope we can also conclude a successful trade negotiation alongside that as well.
Okay, I think I've got time for one last question. I want to go back to the point Angela was raising about the £15 billion that you scored for PPE in the statement last week. And, you know, that's half a Trident programme. So can I just ask you to assure the committee that you and the Chief Secretary will go back and ask some very hard questions about some of the spending that happened and making sure that we've got perhaps a really, really big stockpile of PPE for that money?
Yeah, I can assure you, both the Chief Secretary, I, and the rest of Treasury keep as close an eye as we can on all these things. I think, obviously, I don't have the detail of those individual contracts that Angela mentioned, but you know, DHSE no doubt will be able to talk more about those. But you're right, we of course should be very prudent with taxpayers' money. It is a crisis and we are operating at pace and trying to do things quickly to protect ourselves, but that doesn't mean that we should not be responsible with the decisions we're making, and we take that responsibility very seriously.
Thank you, Chancellor.
Harriet, thank you. Going to Rushanara, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chancellor.
Hi.
I want to start off by saying that obviously all of us appreciate what you did immediately as the virus hit with the job retention scheme and some of the other interventions. But so far from the responses on those who've been left behind does seem to today suggest that your ability to listen and respond and take into account the perspectives of colleagues, and it's actually 3 million households, according to the Standard Life Foundation, the New Starter Justice Campaign, the all-party group on the excluded, with close to 100 members of parliament joining across parties, who are very concerned about people who are being left behind, because, as your Chief Secretary said in the last session when I asked him, you had to look at the hard edges when you were introducing a program that could be simply, easily applied. And as a result, there have been trade-offs. But, you know, taking into account your party's references to levelling up, this crisis has obviously created huge problems. And your response and inability to take into account the need to do something to help those who've been left out, the 3 million, does feel like you've stopped listening. What do you have to say to that? And is there anything you could do in terms of reconsidering to help the 3 million households that still haven't had the support that they need? And they're not earning 200,000. You know, I've got freelancers, I've got, you know, supply teachers who have suffered in this crisis, who haven't got anything because of being left out.
I think, I'm sorry, there's probably not much I can add to my previous responses on this, but you know, these decisions were made with reason, and I've tried to explain them, and I'm happy to explain them again. But we go back to, for example, this £50,000 one. It's not a question of not listening; it's a question of a decision that I took to target support on those who I thought most needed it, and to draw a line at a place that I thought was reasonable, where people's incomes were in the top 5%, and I thought that was a reasonable place to be. And people can disagree with that, and I completely understand that, and they will be upset. But that's not a question of me not listening. That's a question of me making a decision and explaining it, and we're disagreeing it, and that's the job I have.
Let me move on to then my next question, which is partly related to this point. Earlier on to Angela's question, you talked about your response to the job retention bonus and the £9.4 billion you're going to spend on that, and your response to, you know, targeted approaches not being appropriate. There seems to be an inherent contradiction. On the one hand, you're not prepared to target support and respond to the 3 million households that are excluded. On the other hand, you're prepared to give a £9.4 billion job retention bonus, which, you know, and I don't often quote the Spectator as a Labour MP, which the Spectator has taken apart because it will lead to perverse incentives, with businesses bringing back people that they might have made redundant so that they can benefit from the furlough scheme, and getting rid of people who might have put their lives at risk in order to do their jobs during the pandemic. And that doesn't seem like a particularly targeted response that is going to be effective, and is very costly. So what do you have to say to that?
If you have is there some people or group of people do you think that should not be eligible for the job retention bonus?
The question is, Are you actually?
Because again, we're hearing it should be more targeted, but being more targeted means people should be excluded. And I'm just wondering who should be excluded from it.
Chancellor, you asked me a question. What I'm saying is that it is possible, quite possible, and there are commentators, not necessarily on the left actually, who are concerned that your response, your approach could lead to smaller businesses, medium-sized businesses not actually getting the help they need through this scheme and being able to take advantage of the bonus, because they're not going to be able to afford to pay people the salary and get the £1,000 bonus. But others who may not need it are likely to not need the support will get the bonus. So could you at least send us an impact assessment of how this?
So that's fair. So let me respond to that. As I've completely acknowledged, there is dead weight in the scheme, as there was in the furlough scheme and the vast majority of interventions we've made, right? So I think it's hard to be against the principle of dead weight in principle if you're in favour of some of these other things that have to have been developed at scale and at speed. In an ideal world, everything would be completely targeted, but that is not the ideal world that we actually live in, where we're dealing with something happening at this scale, speed, and severity, which requires a different response. But to your point specifically, I'll walk you through why I think the impact is actually very positive. If you look at who uses the furlough scheme, 95% plus of the 1 million businesses are small and medium-sized businesses. 2/3 of the employees work for those small and medium-sized businesses, 5, 10, 15 employees furloughed. So those are exactly the overwhelming number of businesses who constitute this population. So that's the first thing. So if you're a small business with 5 employees that you furloughed and brought back, £5,000 will make a lot of difference given the economics of a business of that size. I think the second thing to say is, to your point, well, how do you compare it to employment costs, which is the right question to ask. If you look at the 50th percentile or average of someone in the furlough population and look at the total employment costs from August through to January and compare that to the £1,000 to that, the £1,000 represents roughly, because we can't be completely precise about the maths, but roughly about a 20% of the employment costs over that period. Now, 20% is quite a significant incentive for employment outcomes. So I actually think all the labour market evidence we have from previous hiring subsidies or apprentice incentives, which are typically set at around 11%, and there's good studies on this, have shown positive labour market outcomes. So I do believe, given where it is set, it will have a very positive impact on hiring and retention decisions for that group.
So in terms of the interventions you've made, the £30 billion or so of interventions you made, are you confident that alongside the interventions you made with the job retention programme and the support to businesses, on balance, that what you're doing is going to be enough to prevent the projected rapid rise in unemployment, including the youth unemployment numbers, which are very worrying for all of us? And if you're not, obviously we've got the budget later on in the year. Do you feel that it might have been better to do more now, or is it okay to wait till later in the year? Because people are very concerned about a second wave of the coronavirus pandemic, concerned about uncertainty around what kind of deal we're going to have on Brexit and how much friction there'll be even if we secure a deal, or in the worst case scenario, if there's a no deal. Do you think that package is adequate for now, or should you have taken advantage and gone for something much more ambitious and bold now?
So I would agree with you. I'm particularly worried about youth unemployment. Young people are 2.5 times more likely to work in closed sectors. We know that. And we also know from experience and from academic and economic evidence that young people are the ones at the greatest risk of scarring. If they lose contact with the labour market early on in their careers, that has a very damaging impact on them for years and years to come, which is why it's right and appropriate to target interventions on them, which is why we launched the Kickstart scheme, which will particularly and acutely focus on young people up to the age of 4.
Sarah is telling me that I'm running out of time, so I've just got a quick supplementary on that.
We really are.
I very much welcome it. But
I'm going to have to stop you there,
or the ITS scheme of the 80s?
Order.
Yes,
order, other members of the committee are not going to get in with any questions if members go well over the time allocated. So I'm going to have to stop that contribution there. I'm really sorry about that. Can we move on now to Julie, please? Thank you. Julie, you need to unmute, Julie, I think. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll start again. Thank you, Chancellor, and good afternoon.
Hi.
And I'd like to turn to the corporate sector, if I may, and just very briefly turn to something that's been alluded to a couple of times. I completely accept your position about not referring to future fiscal policy. Would you agree that, however, that for the corporate sector, the prospect, just the fear of future taxation can be a real drag on investment and recruitment, and therefore a drag on our potential recovery?
I think, Julie, the corporate sector has been through an incredibly tough time, right? I mean, it's been a really difficult period of time. I mean, that's why we've put in place what we've done, and we've provided an enormous amount of support over the last few months to businesses, whether it's through business rate holidays, tax deferrals, cash grants, and indeed an enormous government guaranteed loan programme, all of which is designed to help business. And obviously last week's announcements, again, supporting businesses so that they can protect jobs, because that's what we would like them to do. I think they can see very strongly that we are trying to stand behind them at this time. The reception, at least, and what I'm hearing is businesses are very appreciative of what we've done, welcoming of it. Obviously, there are some people who would like more, like different things, but I think in general, you know, we've done what we can to really give them as good a boost as we can coming out of lockdown and hopefully safeguard as many jobs as possible.
And you referred earlier, and I accept what you say about historical corporate debt levels being relatively low. We've seen estimates from Citi UK, however, that estimate that the scale of unsustainable corporate debt could be in the region of about £100 billion, with about half of that being borne by SMEs. I mean, it's unrealistic, isn't it, to think that the private sector will invest on that scale, so that government intervention by way of bailouts, equity investments is inevitable?
Well, I mean, I said before, I don't think necessarily it's inevitable. I think we need to look at the evidence, see what's going on. I think our starting position was very good coming into this. We don't know the exact shape of the recovery, so that will obviously have an impact on the sustainability of debt, as you know, depending on how rapid and steep a recovery we have. But you know, I've seen the report from Citi UK and others, and you know, as with everything, we're happy to listen and hear ideas from people if they think that there are things that we can do.
Are you, in principle, are you comfortable with the prospect of bailouts and equity investments? Picking winners, if you like?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not. It's not something that I think government should get into the business and habit of doing. It's not my money, it's taxpayers' money, it's not the government's money. And if that's being put to help very specific individual companies, if that's what your question is targeted on, I think the bar for that kind of intervention is very high. You know, a large bespoke individual company support, I think that the bar for that is very high. Obviously, government is always the kind of last resort person who can do that now and historically, but you know, it should be exceptionally rare. It should only be in situations where a company has some strategic value, it is clearly has a long-term viable future, and indeed the existing equity holders and creditors have shared in the burden and are not just looking for a free ride on the taxpayer, that they understand the situation has changed, and that will mean, you know, have implications for their current investments or lending to that business. And then even if that all works, you know, for the taxpayer, you would like to have conditions attached to anything that you might do concerning executive pay, climate change, treatment of suppliers, et cetera, right? Some employment protection. So as I said, it's not a situation that I would want us to be in. It remains there for exceptional situations. Thus far, there has been one instance of it through this entire crisis, which gives you a sense of how rare it should be, and I think partly that is a reflection on the wide-scale support that we've put in place, which has helped the vast majority of businesses.
From your comments, can I draw the inference that Project Birch, for example, is still on the table, and that we might hear more over the coming months?
You know, I probably don't. I mean, I try and shy away from these names of things, but I think government is always, ultimately, in any country, government is always the lender of last resort. That is always the case. That was the case before this crisis, and it will be the case forever. Now, clearly, is there going to be a slightly more a bigger call on government's role in that regard during a period of financial distress like this? Yes. That said, the bar remains where it should be, that this is something that should be a rare situation. A variety of different conditions and criteria need to be fulfilled for it to be a plausible and sensible thing to be happening. And thus far, only the one situation has emerged. So
thank you. Okay. Did we, Chancellor, lack public institutions to help distribute funds during the crisis, government funds? And is this a legacy issue that you would look to address in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, because we have, obviously, the British Business Bank is an institution. It doesn't do direct lending in that way, so we have had to use the existing banking system to deploy credit to people. And obviously, as I think we've discussed previously, and certainly other colleagues have raised with me in the chamber, trying to implement loan guarantee schemes is one thing. Making sure that credit flows to individual businesses is another. So are there things that we need to look at as how all that process worked? Of course, right? And as we get through the other end of this, and we can figure out, well, hopefully not next time, but what would we do differently, etc. What would we change? We need to make sure that if we want credit to flow to businesses, we have a way to do that. And working through the banking system is one option. Other countries have slightly more state-oriented banks. It's right that we look at all of that in the round and make sure that the British Business Bank is doing what we need it to do, and our relationships with the banks and what they are as well, that they can do what they need to do.
Thank you. I think I can squeak in one quick question about the global response. We heard a few weeks ago from Geeta Gopinath from the IMF that if there was a scenario of a second wave, that the IMF's resources would be sorely tested. Would you and the UK government be open to leading or supporting an increase in their resources, should that be the case?
Yes, I think the IMF has, its lending commitments are about a quarter of its overall resources at the moment. I might be off by a bit, but there or thereabouts. So I think they're okay for now. That said, I'm in regular contact with Chris Lino, who runs the IMF, as part of the G7 and G20 forum. And as you've probably heard from Geeta, there's been unprecedented calls on the IMF, given the crisis. What I would say is, I think we should be proud of the fact that as a country we responded very quickly. I think we were one of the first countries to respond quickly to the IMF's call for extra help. We invested about £150 million in something called the Catastrophe Containment Relief Trust, which is one of the most concessionary elements of what the IMF does. We also did a £2 billion loan to the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, which is similarly one of their more concessionary ends of what they do. We obviously stand ready to work with other members to provide resources as needed. I think they're fine for now. The other thing that, again, for interest is vaccines and therapeutics, where we are the single largest contributor to CEPI, with just shy of £300 million, and led a global effort that the Prime Minister championed to get international investment into vaccines and therapeutics. But it's you're right, we should keep an eye on it, because there's been unprecedented calls on the IMF.
Thank you very much. My time's up.
Really, thank you. And going to Anthony, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to you both for giving us your time this afternoon, and also I think thank you to the Treasury team for the excellent work you've been doing responding to the economic crisis. I know you can't commit yourself to future tax policy, but I've got a question about future spending on infrastructure. Just before the crisis, you announced a £640 billion plan on infrastructure spending over the next 5 years, an absolutely vast amount of money. Can we still afford it?
Yeah, I mean, Anthony, again, ditto all future spending and tax policy for future spending reviews and budgets. But I can completely commit to you that we remain ambitious about our infrastructure plans. I mean, it's something that the Prime Minister champions from the front. You would have heard that repeatedly from him. You will hear it from me. And the reason for that is simple, is that we believe that that can be something that drives long-term growth and productivity in the country. And to the extent that we do have low interest rates at the moment, the best thing to do with that is to use that to invest in infrastructure, right? It's not so much to use that to fund current spending. Most people would say, great, use that to invest in long-term capital projects that will drive up your growth rate. That's what most people say when they say take advantage of low long-term interest rates. So that's our plan. I think currently this year, we plan to spend £88 billion coming into this year. That represented a 20% increase on last year, and it represents about a tripling of the average amount that we've spent over the previous few decades. So even if that moves around a little bit, there's been a significant step change up, and I think that's the right thing for the country's long-term growth and productivity.
The Prime Minister recently announced his plan to build, to use his phrase. Some of that was obviously about planning regulations, but he announced some measures to, I think, accelerate slightly some infrastructure projects. How much have you been able to accelerate? And aren't there risks to that you end up investing in projects which aren't good value for money?
Yeah, and I think that's there's two different things. I think you make a very fair point. So one is we were able to bring forward over £5 billion worth of investment into this year that previously we were going to do later, that we found a way to do it this year, and that helps drive our recovery and create jobs. So that's what the Prime Minister talked about. Separately, I think he also talked about something called Project Speed, which is what you're also asking about, is more generally, if we look at how we build infrastructure in this country, we're taking a fresh look end to end at the entire process and figuring out if we can do things faster. I think there's a general perception that it takes a long time to get things done, and that's a function of lots of different things. So it's right that there's process around planning, that we fulfill certain environmental requirements, that people have an ability to take part in a process, and then obviously we need to design things and then build them safely with kind of minimal disruption. That said, and then also the Treasury plays a part at every stage of that process, approving things. So we need to look at that entire process and figure out, is it as fast as it can be, but you're right, subject to the constraint that we still need to do things effectively and not just say, oh great, here's cash, get on with it, without any scrutiny. So we've got to get that balance right, but given we've got these ambitious plans, I think it's right that we look at our processes and figure out if they are, if they're as good as they can be. And the Infrastructure Projects Authority, which is a reasonably recent creation, can play a really important central role in that, and I think that will be quite valuable.
Can I just pick up on you on that point? So one of our previous witnesses, Professor Philip Booth from the Institute of Economic Affairs, said that we don't seem to have an effective mechanism in the UK for the government to pick high return projects, infrastructure projects. Do you think that is an issue?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think. I don't know if Dan has the exact number. There's an interesting, it's interesting but not great stat that if you look over a long period of time, we don't do a great job of kind of post-match analysis, right? We don't evaluate things of our major projects. Once they're done, we don't systematically go back and evaluate the project and figure out, okay, it said it was going to cost X, it turns out it costed Y, and the benefit we thought was A and now it's B. We don't systematically do that, and that's not us. That's been the case for a very long period of time. I think we obviously have to correct that. We need to figure out if what do we think we're doing? Did we do it? And learn from that so that what we do in the future can be better and more effective. And I think that's where the IPA in particular can play a really important role. I don't know, Dan, if you have anything to add on that.
No, sorry, I don't have the number to hand. So
yeah.
Finally, last question, because time is running out. I understand you're evaluating the Green Book, the Treasury book that enables you to which allows you to gives you guidance on how to assess which projects are value for money and which ones aren't, which public spending is good value. With a view, as I understand, review is to see how it can be changed to pursue the levelling up agenda. Can you give some more light on that? Wouldn't that just be directing public spending to less efficient projects? but
yeah,
more.
no, yes, I think that's a fair question to ask. What I would say is that it's worth us looking at it. I mean, I think broadly, there's nothing. It's not that it's completely broken, right? And I think the Green Book, let's be clear, the methodology in it is one which many countries around the world have looked at and said, well, that's a pretty sensible way to evaluate projects. There are 5 different, different dimensions on which a project is evaluated. The pure financial return is just one aspect of it. So the methodology, as it's constructed, already has the ability to take into account lots of different things. That said, we haven't looked at it in a while, and a lot of people have said that the way that some of the underlying quite nitty-gritty calculations work, they might essentially bias investment in a particular direction, even though that's not the policy objective. That doesn't mean it's less value for money or it's not productivity enhancing. It's just some of our formulas might be constructed in a way that creates outcomes that we don't actually want to see. So we think it's right to kind of rigorously go through it. We want to involve a lot of outside people. Diane Coyle is someone who's written about this quite a lot, for example, who I've spoken to in my old job. So that's the process we're going through. I don't know, Dan, if you have anything else to add on that.
No, just to agree. I mean, it's looking at how the formula works and the extent to which, for example, some housing projects, if you invest in an area with higher house prices, you apparently get a better return, even though actually in terms of the kind of long-term economic impacts, investing in an area with lower house prices might be the right outcome. So that's an example, but it's something that I think the plan is for it to feed into the spending review later in the year.
Exactly, yeah. And so I think actually, I launched this whole initiative as Chief Secretary, and I represent a northern seat and a rural seat. I'm someone who's quite acutely interested in this area, so I think it's worth us going through it. And one of it is the formulas and the other bits and bobs of the process, and then it's actually how is it used across Whitehall, because there's a separate thing as we have this thing, and then actually are we using it in the way it should be used across Whitehall, and departments actually fully utilising the flexibility of it or making sure that they use it properly. So that's all part of the process.
Okay, thank you both. I've run out of time.
Great, thank you, Anthony. And over to Siobhan, please.
Thank you, Chair. Chancellor, we know that not people aren't equally affected by the coronavirus lockdown. If we look at private renters, they are 50% more likely to have fallen behind on their housing costs than people in other tenures. They are also likely to be in the occupations that they are more likely to lose their jobs. Given that they represent 20% of the workforce, they fear the reinstatement of repossession hearings in September and of losing their jobs. What is in the pipeline for them that doesn't already exist? And I would be very grateful if he didn't refer to the Discretionary Housing Payment Fund, given that it already exists.
Which I obviously can't comment on things that don't already exist, but I think it's probably worth reflecting on the fact that there has been a 5-month suspension of possession proceedings, which I think, as you said, has been welcome. We're obviously entering a different phase of this crisis now, and we're moving out of it. So we need to look at what's appropriate going forward. That would be a decision for the Housing Secretary, and who is in constant touch with the sector. Obviously, there's been some other things on our end at the FCA with regard to working with lenders to make sure that there are buy-to-let landlord payment holidays or equivalents of. That's happened. And then lastly, I would say that for the full year, it's not just for now, that the local housing allowance has been significantly increased in generosity, which helps renters, and it takes up to the 30th percentile, and that's something that is here for the full year.
I'm not sure that private renters feel that the government is showing them generosity, but 700,000 children have been unable to complete any schoolwork since the lockdown because they don't have access to the internet or adequate devices at home. When they finally return to school, these children will be further behind their classmates. But the digital divide isn't restricted to the lockdown, and the costs are fractional compared to the sums discussed today. So would the Chancellor make funds available for children on free school meals to have internet access and adequate devices at home so they don't fall further behind their classmates?
Siobhan, so I completely share with you a passion to make sure that our children get the support they need during this. It's been one of the great sadnesses of this whole period that our children have not been in school, and that's been something that is without doubt a tragedy. Now, this is obviously not my specific department responsibility, so you'll forgive me if I don't have all the exact details to hand. You know, we did provide resources and funding to the Department for Education, and the Secretary of State has, I think, done a very good job of getting not just laptops, but I think internet connectivity out to a very large number of vulnerable children and their households, and alongside that, making sure that resources were available. I want to say the name of it is I think the Oak Academy that was created in order to provide those resources for children during this period. And you will know about the very significant announcement that he made a few weeks ago about a catch-up programme that will be a mix of intensive tutoring for our most vulnerable children, combined with also a per school amount as well for them to use in a way that is appropriate to help children catch up once they are back at school.
As the Chancellor will know, the Oak Academy is an online service. If you don't have the internet or a device, it is really no use to you. But if we move to ethnic minorities, we know that people of ethnic minority are more likely to be impacted by coronavirus, are more likely to be made redundant than furloughed. On a Wednesday, I run the queue at my local food bank, and I know that 2/3 of the people in that queue every week are from Black and ethnic minority communities. What plans does he have to help those people?
You mean what plans do I have? I mean,
just the government have.
So I think that, I mean, just to go back to the schools thing for a second, as I said, you'll forgive me because it's not my department responsibility. There has been provision made and laptops and connectivity provided to a large number of vulnerable children.
Year 10s, Chancellor.
So again, you have to forgive me because I'm not entirely sure exactly which year has received what and how many children, but yeah. I wouldn't say it's not fair to say that nothing has happened. Secretary of State has very early on in this crisis made sure that some of our most vulnerable children did have access to connectivity and laptops. And to the point on ethnic minorities, one thing I would say again is why the focus on the hospitality sector is important. It's a sector with 2 million people who are disproportionately lower paid, younger women, and from ethnic minorities. And they are overrepresented in those industries, which is why I think the initiatives last week, as part of the plan for jobs targeted at that sector, including Eat Out to Help Out, will disproportionately benefit people from those communities. I want to try and safeguard as many of those jobs as possible. And I think, as I said, as you said, people from those communities are disproportionately represented in those jobs. So that will be a policy that I think will provide benefit to many of them.
Chair, I don't want to take too much time because I know others might not get in. Have I got time for another question, or shall I move on?
You do have time. That's fine. Thank you for asking.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Can I just say, Chancellor, I don't know about the other female members of this committee, but I bridled when earlier in an answer to Angela Eagle's question that you suggested you didn't have time to mention women in your 22-minute statement. We are 51% of the population. We are more likely to lose our jobs. We are more likely to be not able to do the hours that we normally do. What has the Chancellor got to say to constituents like mine, like Winnie, who works at Marks and Spencer's and is presently on unpaid leave because she simply cannot get childcare for her children?
Sorry, Siobhan, actually what I said was, when I asked about the childcare sector is what I took her to mean, and I said I couldn't mention in a 22-minute speech every single sector of the economy, of which childcare is one, and I talked about the provision we've provided for nurseries through business rates and funding them, because obviously it's very important that that sector remains strong. I think that in a 22-minute speech is just typically not going to be possible to mention every single sector and every single group of people.
We are 51% of the population.
But it wasn't about women, it was about the concept of the childcare sector, which is not to not mention women. And actually, specifically, I think I said before, women are disproportionately represented in the 2 million jobs in the hospitality sector. This is, as I've said repeatedly, it's a matter of social justice that we are able to reopen this sector. The 2 million people working in this sector are disproportionately young. Young people also are important. They're disproportionately women, they're disproportionately lower paid, and they're disproportionately from ethnic minorities. all of which are things that you care about and I care about, which is why last week I announced policies, which I know I'm unclear whether you support or not, the Eat Out to Help Out discount. I thought it was worth doing something novel that we haven't tried before, because I want to throw everything I could at trying to protect those 2 million jobs because of the types of people who are in those jobs. Women will disproportionately benefit if we can safeguard those 2 million jobs. And it's because I care passionately about that I did the things I did last week.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Siobhan. And going over now to Mike, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Chancellor, for attending. Off the back of Siobhan's comments there, I want to discuss very quickly some of the areas in which women are predominantly employed, and that's obviously health and social care, local authority spending. I want to be able to touch on. And following on from Anthony's question on the issue of future spending reviews, you've announced a spending review. The question is, will this be a full 3-year review, and when will departments receive their instructions for the review? And will we get some positive news on free hospital car parking for NHS workers in the next budget?
All right, sorry, Mike, lots there. Let me just try and work through them. So, I mean, with regard to women in particular, I think it's probably worth bearing in mind as well some of the policies that I announced at budget, which would disproportionately benefit women. One was obviously abolishing the tampon tax, which is something we did we announced in March. Also, we introduced 12 weeks of neonatal leave and pay. And I think the third thing was the changes we made to enhancing tax-free childcare, which will mean the parents of about 500,000 children will have access to greater childcare, particularly that wraparound childcare provided through schools. Those are all things that we did at budget, which will be, I think, were warmly welcomed at the time, and obviously will continue to be of benefit to many. With regard to the spending review, timing for that would be announced in due course, so you'll have to wait, but I don't think you have to wait too long. It's something that normally would be launched at some point in the summer in order to conclude in the autumn, if that's what one wanted to do. Of course, we have to do that, and that will happen reasonably soon.
So, in terms of the future spending review, another area where women are disproportionately affected is on their pensions. So a straight question: are you planning to revisit the pensions triple lock in the next budget? And by reference, does that mean that
the same answer, Mike, that I've had to give to Angela and Harriet and Mel and others is, I can't comment on future fiscal policy now.
I know that you answered a similar question from the chair, but I have to ask it again. In those circumstances where you did look at something like that, that would be a move away from Conservative Party manifesto. Now, I know that times are a lot different and COVID-19 has had its effects, but would it be acceptable to you to consider breaking away from that manifesto and some of the promises contained within it, like protecting the triple lock?
I think, well, your committee on the triple lock has had evidence from others, I think, which has pointed out the anomaly in the way that it might work, depending on the very particular trajectory of earnings declines and then rapid rises over the next few years. I think your committee is kind of very abreast of the particular mechanical issues that causes, which are appropriate for people to raise and appropriate for us to look at the right time. But commenting on future policy is not something I can do, Mike.
Okay, well, what about local authorities? Local authorities, as you know, bore the brunt of COVID-19. They provided a lot of support, financial support, which has been necessary to keep their communities going. But what we've heard is that funding for local authorities was treated as the residual balancing items in previous spending reviews. And can you promise us that this will never happen again?
Yeah, Mike, so obviously, remember when I was local government minister, I remember we discussed exactly this. And it's absolutely right that, from 2010 for several years, local government, took a very heavy share of the burden of bringing our public finances back to a sustainable position. I mean, it's something I said repeatedly as local government minister. That is a fact. They did a heroic job on the front line of doing that. You're right to highlight that. I share with you an admiration for everything that they've achieved. That said, that has changed. So certainly when I was local government minister and thereafter, they have had 2 years of record rises in core spending power, significantly ahead of inflation, at the rate of growth of the economy. You know, rates of increase 3.5, maybe even 4, depending on how you cut it, over the last couple of years. So that's been the trajectory up until the crisis, which I think is very positive and was warmly welcomed by the LGA, the County Council Network, District Council Network, and others. Now, during the crisis, they've again had to play a really difficult, they've had a very difficult job to do. They've done it very well. They've been provided with over £3.5 billion of incremental funding to help them do that, including things like £600 million for infection control at care homes. And they've also, just a week or two ago at the LGA conference, the local government secretary announced a kind of landmark deal to do some loss sharing around some of the fees and charges that they were missing, which again was warmly welcomed. So I think people can see from that we have done what we can to support local government at what's been a difficult time for them, but that comes on the back of 2 years of quite strong increases in core spending power for them as well.
And you do have future plans, or you will factor in future plans for local authority budgets to cope with things like social care and the pressures that are brought to play on that, surely.
Yeah, and that's why we committed to providing an extra £1 billion a year and making sure that we sustain that to help address some of the pressures in the system. That's what we already have done and plan to continue to do so.
So linking up with my cheeky question, if you like, on free car parking, I'm very grateful, the committee is very grateful that you responded quickly to our intervention on the taxation of employees over COVID-19 testing by employers. But learning lessons, especially in the care sector, to what extent have successive government failures to deal with funding in social care caused the current problems in social care? Bearing in mind we were promised a green paper that was ditched. We're now waiting on a white paper on the social care, on the future of social care provision.
Well, I think on social care, the Secretary of State is in charge of trying to find cross-party consensus. That's what we committed to trying to do. I think he has written to your party leader, and obviously coronavirus then happened and rightly has occupied all of our thoughts in responding to that as a priority. But we remain committed to trying to find and build that consensus. I think on something like social care, where the implications are for many years into the future, if we can find a broad cross-party consensus on a sustainable solution, that would be preferable, so that people had confidence that it would be a sustainable solution. And I know that the Secretary of State for Social Care remains committed to that.
So a sustainable solution for you, would you rule in or would you rule out integration of health and social care as one big budget heading?
I think that the detail of that is for the Secretary of State to get into. I mean, I think he's, as I said, started those conversations, as far as I'm aware, with your party, Mike. But it's important that whatever reforms that we want to put in place for social care, we also need to, in the round, to look at what reforms do people want to make and how do they get paid for, and we need to have that conversation in the round. Structures is a different part of that. I mean, I think you've spoken a lot about local government. They would have strong views on the right way to deliver social care, but obviously those conversations, will happen with the Secretary of State for Social Care as he's doing that work.
Well, my last question then is back to the economics. The economic update revised government spending upwards by 30 billion over the previous OBR estimates, which were published on the 19th of June. Why was the figure for public spending in the OBR estimates so much lower?
I think it was just a timing point, but Dan can give you the exact chapter and verse.
So what the OBR had included in their sort of regular update on the cost of the government's coronavirus interventions was what was announced at the budget, and then several specific announcements that have been made by other departments. given we were doing the plan for jobs and we were producing in one place, which we haven't so far, a full record of all of the interventions about supporting the economy through coronavirus, we updated the actual approvals that the Treasury has given. Most of these were in the public domain. So, for example, the Health Secretary had talked about the £30 billion of additional funding for the Department for the NHS and through the Department of Health and Social Care, but the totality hadn't been confirmed in terms of what that meant for overall public spending. So it was simply, and the OBR yesterday, alongside their fiscal sustainability report, updated all of their, as they do on a fortnightly basis, updated on the basis of the latest confirmed numbers from the government, and indeed provided their early estimates of the plan for jobs measures. So it's, in a sense, it's unusual that normally you would only have an update on these sorts of things at a budget. But given the nature of the crisis and the government's response, the OBR has taken to producing these more ad hoc updates on government policy, and so they reflect what the government has confirmed, and for them they needed confirmation from the Treasury the total amount of extra spending implied by the individual announcements that departments have made.
I would have liked to have pressed again on the issue of free car parking for NHS workers. They deserve it, but I'm out of time. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Mike. And I think you did just press again, actually. So well done. Can I go now finally to Steve, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. Chancellor, I'm just looking at the said fiscal sustainability report with its quite horrific charts, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Yeah. The public finances are not on a sustainable trajectory, are they?
No, Steve, they're not. That was the conclusion of the OBR report, and indeed, as they said, has been the conclusion of every report like that they've done. And I liked all your highlights in that. But yes, it's important that our public finances are put on a sustainable footing in the medium term. It was right now to act in the way we did. It's not something I ever imagined having to do, certainly not on this scale, but it was the right thing to do. I think the OBR acknowledged that the situation would be far worse if we hadn't done that. But once we get through this, it's absolutely important, both for the economy and otherwise, for us to have sustainable medium-term public finances.
And do you think that members of Parliament and the public, and indeed commentators, have quite yet internalised what all of this means to the public finances?
Well, hopefully you can do your bit, Steve, to spread the good word. But it's probably hard for me to say. But I certainly will keep saying that. It's something that's personally important to me. You'll know that from speeches that I've made from the back benches. It's the right thing to do. And one thing the OBR highlighted is that, well, as Harriet talked about, we can't be assured that interest rates will always be this low, which is one thing we have to have in mind, and it might be that they just asymmetrically change. And the other thing is we keep having these once-in-a-generation shocks with seemingly, quite regularity, right? This is the second once-in-a-generation shock we've had in 10 years, and that therefore makes you think, what you do with public finances in quote-unquote good times may need to be a bit different, and then there's just an intergenerational argument about living within our means and making sure that we're looking after, our finances that we continue to enjoy. So I think over the medium term, absolutely, we need to return them to a sustainable place. And I would hope that, parliamentarians and the public, I think broadly would sympathise with that. I think it seems to me to be reasonably common sense, and hopefully people will get that.
Yes, thank you very much for your candour on this point. I want to turn to the border and Brexit. It's 2 years and 7 days since I resigned over the decisions taken at Exchequer's summit. I resigned with David Davison, indeed the Prime Minister, over the Brexit policy. We've now got a far, far better policy on Brexit. But the reason I mention it is that at that summit 2 years and a week ago, it was decided that the government of the day would dramatically accelerate its preparedness for Brexit. And I was glad to hear that, because I nearly resigned in the January over foot dragging. So how can it be that on the border today that we're not ready as we should be to leave in January?
Steve, I'd say, you would have seen the CDL announcement from earlier in the week, and we will have a fully functioning border on January the 1st. We've, as you would have seen, our announcement investing £800 million for a range of different things for border and other preparedness, which is absolutely the right thing to do. You and I absolutely share desire. We need to make sure we are ready. We have the infrastructure that's ready to handle a new set of trading relationships. And what has changed is, as Michael pointed out, we're going to implement the brand new border in phases. And the reason we're doing that is because it's pragmatic. It's only going to take a few months to do it. There's a roadmap for what's happening. And that's because, look, coronavirus has had an impact on businesses' ability to prepare as well as ours. So it's right that we ease people in to the new set of arrangements. That's something that I think will be helpful for business. It will help us adjust. But the key thing is no one should be under any illusions. We are fully committed, prepared and ready to transition to a new set of trading relationships. And I think the announcement on Monday sends a very strong signal to anyone who was doubting that, there is concrete going in the ground and we're ready for the future.
So is there anything that you can do further to ensure that the CDS customs system is ready for day one? I know that the chief system, I believe I know that the chief system is available and can be used for GB, but for Northern Ireland there's additional issues. So is there anything you can do to accelerate the CDS system to be ready for day one?
Yeah, so we are looking at all of that, and over the summer it's going to be one of my areas of focus, Steve, hopefully now having moved out of the acute phase of dealing with the lockdown and coronavirus. That it's something that I'm going to spend a bit more time on over the summer in particular. Now, look, HMRC have been busy doing lots of different things. You're very familiar with the various demands on those various different customs systems. But I remain committed, the team remain committed to making sure that we're ready to go. The roadmap that we've set out is one that we're absolutely committed and confident of delivering to. But you're absolutely right, we should be on it and making sure that happens.
Can I particularly press you to look at the obligations on the European Union in the withdrawal agreement that they shall adopt reasonable exemptions to the Union Customs Code that are proposed by the UK? Because I think I've been party through Prosperity UK's work to ensuring that we have set out, we as Brexiteers took ownership, made sure we set out alternatives. So could I particularly press you to make sure that your officials, HMRC in particular, and indeed Cabinet Office, right across government, everywhere that there is a border function, that they ensure that they put forward reasonable proposals to the European Union, which can be seen as reasonable and therefore shall be adopted by the European Union to ensure that that GB Northern Ireland border, well, slip of the tongue, but that those GB-NI arrangements are absolutely as seamless as possible.
Yeah, no, you're right, Steve. I share with you an ambition to make that all as seamless as possible. We're already engaged in the detail through the joint committee and a technical working group on going through all the various arrangements for different aspects of that. But thank you for reminding me of the clause that I will happily remind everyone of.
Thank you. Now, I think I really should say, because we have all held your feet to the fire, as is our job, but I have to say, I think you've been dealt a hand as Chancellor that's as bad as it could possibly be, and that is borne out in the fiscal sustainability report. And I think with just the one or two exceptions that we've touched on with support for those who've not been supported, where you've made your position very clear, it's difficult to see, apart from those areas, you could be playing this hand any better. But can I just ask you, knowing that you're not going to comment on future tax, and I don't want to draw you there, have you got any studies going on about what the taxable capacity of the UK economy actually is and how close we are to the limits of taxation? The reason I ask that is I've long paid attention to the work of the economist David B. Smith, and his work suggests that we are already at the taxable capacity of the UK economy, and that were you to raise the main rates of taxation, you wouldn't raise more money. So without commenting on the tax, or indeed giving the same answer on the tax, are you looking at the taxable capacity of the UK economy, and might you draw some conclusions you can share?
Well, Steve, if you send me his work, I'll be very happy to have a look at it. I think your broader point is a fair one. I think fundamentally we don't tax our way to prosperity. So, where the exact line one draws for that and where we are on the Laffer curve, we can debate. But I think that broad view is one I share. We want people to keep more of their own money. We think that's good for growth. I believe all of that, as you know. I think the flip side is we also have a lot of demands on public services. and they need to be funded. And that is a question that you asked before about, what do people in Parliament, what do people in the country think about all of this? We as a country, we as a Parliament, need, to look at these things in the round. And we want public services. We have expectations on the government to provide certain things. And then we need to look at how we're going to fund those things. And we must have that conversation in the round. And we can't only choose to talk about one side of it without having reference to the other. And I hope, as you said, we can, both with the country and with colleagues, have a sensible conversation about all of these things in the round as we confront some of the tough choices that are coming our way over the next few months. But I'm very grateful to your earlier comments, which were very kind.
Well, Chancellor, finally then, since you were the leading advocate of free ports in the Conservative Parliamentary Party, so I'm absolutely delighted you're now Chancellor of the Exchequer to see those policies through. Could you just finish with just a brief word on your ambition, perhaps not just on free ports, but your ambition for this country, where you want to see our economy in a few years' time?
Steve, well, free ports are an example of something that I believe in, and it's probably a good test case for my broader ambitions. Why? Because free ports use private enterprise to encourage growth and encourage productivity in areas where we want to see more of that. If you look at where our ports are, they're in particular parts of the country that we want to try and make sure are not left behind. They're firmly part of our levelling up agenda, but I want to spread that opportunity to those areas by involving the private sector, because I believe that fundamentally is the best way to drive growth and productivity and prosperity in our country. So, they're a good example of doing that. They also help position us for our new future, which is one as an independent trading nation. It's something we couldn't do before that we can do now, something that makes us look outwards to the world and grows our exports and keeps us connected to places around the world. That's part of our future. And all of that underpinned by a strong investment in people. And the reason I got into this was because of education. And I think the Prime Minister, you've heard him talk passionately about this. I share that passion. We talked about it before as well. Making sure that all our children have the best possible opportunity to thrive in life, and then following that through with opportunities for our adults and young adults to get the skills they need is all part of that mix. So if in the spending review we could deliver on that and make sure people have the skills and the education they need, and then provide lots of growth enhancing opportunities like free ports all around the country, that to me is hopefully a recipe for future success.
That was a bit broader than I expected, Chancellor, but thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Chancellor, I think I've got time just for a 1 minute question or 1 minute answer, and that is that one of the key components of recovery now is going to be the extent to which people readily re-engage with the economy, go out and get involved in retail and bars and pubs and restaurants and so on. You will have lots of real-time data that no doubt you're poring over on an almost daily basis. What is it telling you at the moment?
It's probably sadly too early to tell now. And you can see from around the world as well, it's not as if it's consistent. What most people have seen is a kind of an immediate bump straight after reopening, then a drop back, and then a slow and steady build, but at quite different rates in different countries. And even within different states within the US, you're seeing that data. I think so. We're so early into our opening now that it's hard for me to give you firm conclusions. I mean, yes, are things better than they were? Obviously, they're still quite a bit down on last year, and habits have changed. We also see that in the polling data about people, as you said, people's confidence and security in going out. We need to rebuild that. Part of that will come from the people understanding where we are in the process of the virus, and actually we've done a really good job. And prevalence is really, really been squeezed, which is fantastic news. We're able to control the spread through targeted approaches, which is better. But also as they get out and about, they'll see it's a new normal. The restaurants that we've been talking a lot about have changed. You're ordering on apps, there are screens, you're sitting further apart. The shops, there's no trying on clothes, a different system for returns, one-way systems. All of that is a new normal, which makes it safer. So hopefully that gives people confidence. And things like our Eat Out to Help Out discount are deliberately designed to elicit a behavioural response, which we hope will make a difference to safeguarding those 2 million jobs. But you're absolutely right. it all is ultimately going to come down to confidence. We're a consumption-driven economy. Without confidence, we don't have that consumption, and we all need to do our bit, and hopefully that will happen over the coming weeks and months.
Right. Well, Chancellor, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to Dan as well, but particularly you, Chancellor, for having fielded such a wide variety of questions and having answered in such detail. I think it's fair to say there are some areas in which we have some comfort in what you had to tell us, and there are other areas where we feel you should go a bit further, and I won't repeat in this session at least the issue of the gaps, but do please keep an eye on those who have fallen through the gaps, I think is a message from this committee. But look, all of that apart, we totally recognise, as Steve mentioned, the extraordinary hand that you have been dealt at the moment, the massive challenges that you face. And I think it's only fair for the committee to thank all those at the Treasury and HMRC at the moment who are working incredibly hard to try and get us through this crisis. And we do appreciate all that you're doing. And once again, thank you very much indeed for appearing before the committee. That brings us to a conclusion. Order, order.
Thank you.
Thank you.